So I'd like to talk about how the science of learning can help narrow achievement gaps. So what is the science of learning and why is it important? Well, cognitive science is another name for the science of learning, and it's the study of how to learn. What I'm going to focus on in particular is something called cognitive load theory, which was introduced by Australian psychologist John Sweller in the late 1980s. And it's been said that Sweller's cognitive load theory is the single most important thing for teachers to know. And yet many, perhaps most, probably most, teachers have never heard of it. So why is it so important? Well, teaching grounded in cognitive load theory can narrow gaps between student groups and enable all students to achieve their full potential. So let me explain. Cognitive load theory and cognitive architecture can be sort of summarized in a diagram that looks like this. Now, these are not processes in the brain, or these are not places in the brain, they are processes in the mind. And that first box that says sensory memory, we don't need to worry about that. It just means if you don't pay attention to something, you're probably going to forget it. I think that's pretty obvious. But this middle box, working memory, is crucial. So working memory is that aspect of our consciousness where we are taking in new information and trying to make sense of it. And the important thing to know about working memory is that it is very limited. It can only hold maybe 5 or 7 things at one time, and only for about 20 seconds. And if we have too many new things we're trying to juggle in working memory, then our working memory gets overwhelmed and we forget them. And that burden on working memory is what is called cognitive load. So there is a way around this constraint on working memory, and that is that last box on the right, long-term memory, which is potentially infinite. If we can just withdraw items from long-term memory that we already know, we don't have to juggle them in working memory, and that frees up more space there for things like understanding and retaining new information. The trick is that, first of all, we have to get things from working memory into long-term memory. That's called transfer. And the best way to do that is by attaching some meaning to those things, maybe by explaining them in your own words to someone else, orally or in writing. And then we have to be able to retrieve the items we need from long-term memory when we need them. And that's retrieval. And the best way to ensure that we'll be able to do that is through practice. The more we practice retrieving an item, the more accessible it is to us. So that's the basic idea of cognitive load theory. It's also been said that knowledge is like velcro. It sticks best to other related knowledge. Now, I didn't invent that, but I think it's a great image. And it's really another way of saying that if we have more information in our long-term memory, we have more capacity to retain new information in working memory. Now, some children from more highly educated families are able to acquire more of this velcro at home because their parents may use more sophisticated knowledge and vocabulary and conversation, or take them to museums, all sorts of reasons. But the bottom line is that some children are going to start out with more academic knowledge and vocabulary than others. And those students who start out with more of that velcro keep acquiring more of it because that knowledge helps them retain new information, while others fall farther behind. This is something that's been called, particularly in reading, the Matthew effect. And that's a reference to the Gospel of Matthew, and particularly the part that says the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And this gap between the good readers and the poor readers increases every year that students stay in school, unless schools start building their academic knowledge and vocabulary, the kind of vocabulary that some students are able to acquire at home. And this is really the problem that I wrote this book about, the book called The Knowledge Gap, which both describes the problem and also talks about what we can do about it. So what can we do about it? Now, there are some important findings that flow from cognitive load theory and that conflict with what most teachers learn during their training. So one is having information in long-term memory is what enables students to, find the main idea of a passage or think critically. And teachers are often encouraged to just teach the skill of finding the main idea or thinking or critical thinking in the abstract, but those skills don't work that way. You can only think critically about a topic if you already have information about it stored in long-term memory. Another finding, quizzing students on information makes it easier to retrieve. This is a common form of retrieval practice, but often teachers are told, well, you don't have to worry about students knowing factual information because they can just Google it, and we don't want to waste time quizzing them on that information. It's actually really important to do that. It facilitates learning. When students don't know much about a topic, explicit instruction or storytelling works best. And I'm going to talk more about that in a moment. And lastly, student engagement doesn't necessarily lead to learning. Students can be very engaged, but they may not actually be learning anything. So more on those two things. When teachers don't know these things, instruction can unintentionally advantage students who are already advantaged. So more about that point, those 2 points about explicit instruction and student engagement. So discovery and inquiry-based learning, they're very popular among many teachers, but they're ineffective when students are new to a topic. This has been found with lots of research showing this. So students may have a good time creating a volcano, but what they may remember is how much fun they had creating the volcano rather than the scientific principles that they're really supposed to be learning about. So it's been said, if the learner has no relevant concept about the particular topic in long-term memory, the only thing to do is blindly search for solutions. Novices can engage in problem solving for extended periods and learn almost nothing. It's just too overwhelming on working memory. And that's from an article that is called Putting Students on the Path to Learning. So explicit instruction doesn't have to be just lecturing. It can be discussion and writing and give and take. But just having students try to learn about a new topic through their own inquiry really doesn't work very well. So how does this relate to literacy? Well, we draw on our background knowledge to understand almost everything we read. It may not be obvious, but that's what we're doing. So for example, there's a strong correlation, it's been found, between general academic knowledge, like knowing the answer to in what part of the body does pneumonia occur, and general reading comprehension. And that suggests that to boost reading comprehension and learning, kids need to acquire as much academic knowledge and vocabulary as possible. And it's important to bear in mind that literacy is about much more than reading. All of these things are connected: listening, speaking, reading, and writing. They're all components of literacy. And where cognitive load theory enters into this is that listening and speaking are considered what's called biologically primary. That means they're easier. We don't have to teach kids how to listen or how to speak. It imposes less of a cognitive load. Whereas reading and writing are biologically secondary. They have to be explicitly taught, and they're harder. They impose a heavier cognitive load. So listening and speaking, when kids are still learning to be fluent readers and writers, listening and speaking are the most effective ways to build knowledge and vocabulary. Kids can take in a lot more sophisticated information and understand it through listening and speaking. So listening and speaking can build the knowledge that fuels those more difficult things, reading and writing. So to ensure that all students acquire the academic knowledge that can unlock their potential, the curriculum should connect all those aspects of literacy and go deeply into topics in social studies, history, geography, science, and the arts. Those are the subjects that have the most potential to build the kind of academic knowledge and vocabulary students need to understand what they're reading and to acquire further knowledge. And to minimize the Matthew effect, this knowledge building should begin in the earliest grades. Remember, that gap between groups of students just gets larger the longer we wait. So I'd like to talk for a minute about writing in particular, the potential power of writing. Writing can familiarize students with the conventions of written language, boosting their reading comprehension. Remember, written language is almost always more complex than spoken language. And if students learn how to, for example, use subordinating conjunctions in their own writing, something they may not be familiar with from conversation, they're going to be in a much better position to understand that sort of thing when they encounter it in their reading. Secondly, writing can develop analytical abilities because you're forced to connect different bits of information, decide what's really more important. And it can, for the same reasons, build and deepen knowledge. It's both a form of transferring information powerfully from working memory to long-term memory and practicing retrieving that information. In fact, it's so powerful, it can compensate for gaps in background knowledge, even at upper grade levels. But writing is the hardest thing we ask students to do. Remember, working memory is very limited in its capacity. And inexperienced writers may be juggling everything from letter formation if they're young, spelling, what words to use, how to organize their thoughts, the content they're writing about, and the peculiar syntax and vocabulary of written language. And all of that creates cognitive load. And dealing with this also creates stress, which imposes another burden on working memory. So what can we do about this? Well, we have to observe two principles that enable writing instruction to narrow gaps. First, embed writing activities in the content of the core curriculum to build academic knowledge. So not just a personal essay about what you did last weekend, but write about what you're learning about. And secondly, modulate that cognitive load that writing imposes by beginning at the sentence level. Now, I know of only one method that combines both of these principles, and that's the writing revolution. And I'm the co-author of a book by that title with Judith C. Hockman, who's a veteran educator who developed the method. I don't have time to really go into the method deeply, but can give you a quick example of one of the sentence level activities that it covers. It's called Because, But, and So, and it consists of giving students a sentence stem, the beginning of a sentence about content they're learning, and asking them to finish that sentence with these three different conjunctions. It's also teaching them how to use these conjunctions, which not all students just pick up from their reading. So let's say you're teaching students about this man who's the early 20th century composer, George Gershwin. And by the way, this method is designed to be used across the curriculum and not just in English class. So you could give students the following sentence stems. George Gershwin is considered a musical genius because, but, and so. Each of these sentence stems requires them to retrieve a different kind of information from long-term memory and put that information into their own words, thereby solidifying that information in long-term memory and making it more accessible in the future. There are different ways that students could finish these sentence stems, but here are some examples. Because he captured the spirit of American life in his rhythms and melodies, but critics have identified structural weaknesses in some of his works. So many other composers have tried to emulate his style. Now, cognitive load doesn't stop at the sentence level. Even when students have mastered different ways of constructing sentences, writing at length imposes a cognitive load of its own. Did I say that already? What was I going to say next? And what helps there is for students to have a roadmap in the form of an outline. So this outline calls for them to write down first a topic sentence, and then some details that they want to include in their paragraph, and finally a concluding sentence. And once they've got that roadmap, it's a fairly simple process to transfer it and turn it into a paragraph using those sentence level skills that they've learned to make the writing flow smoothly. So to sum up, students with more academic knowledge and long-term memory have more capacity in working memory to understand and retain new information. To narrow gaps between more and less privileged students, Schools should build academic knowledge beginning in the earliest grades. When learners are new to a topic, teachers should engage in explicit instruction to ensure students retain important information in long-term memory. To boost literacy, the curriculum should go deeply into topics and connect listening, speaking, reading, and writing. Writing is potentially our most powerful lever for building knowledge and analytical ability if cognitive load is carefully modulated. And finally, a knowledge-building curriculum that begins early is our best hope for unlocking the full potential of all students and achieving educational fairness. And of course, all of these gaps have been exacerbated during the pandemic, with some students able to pick up a lot of academic knowledge and vocabulary at home, and others being deprived even of the opportunity they were getting to do that at school. So thank you for listening, and I hope that this has illuminated what the science of learning can do to help us narrow gaps between different groups of students. Thanks.